Christopher Columbus. By 1506, the man who had sailed across the Atlantic 4 times was no longer a celebrated admiral. He was sick, discredited, and fighting for recognition. Christopher Columbus had once returned to Spain in triumph, paraded through the streets as the discoverer of a new world. But his later years were marked by scandal. Reports of brutality in Hispaniola led to his arrest in 1500. He was sent back to Spain in chains, a humiliating fall for a man who believed he was chosen by God. Though eventually released, Columbus never regained his former authority. In his final years, he suffered from severe arthritis, likely reactive arthritis brought on by infection. His body, once hardened by Atlantic crossings, deteriorated. He spent his last months in Valladolid, Spain, still petitioning the crown for the titles and wealth he believed he was owed. On May 20, 1506, Christopher Columbus died at 54 years old. There was no dramatic execution, no battlefield death, just illness, frustration, and fading relevance. He died still insisting he had reached Asia, never fully grasping the scale of what he had set in motion. His body would be moved multiple times over the centuries, buried and reburied across empires he helped create. But the man himself passed quietly, his dreams of glory diminished, his legacy forever debated. Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan set out to circle the globe. He never made it home. In 1519, Magellan departed Spain with 5 ships, determined to find a westward route to the Spice Islands. The journey was brutal: starvation, mutiny, shipwreck. By the time his expedition reached the Philippines in 1521, only a fraction of his men remained. But Magellan had grown confident, perhaps too confident. After converting local ruler Raja Humabon to Christianity, Magellan agreed to assist him in a conflict against a rival chief on the island of Mactan. On April 27, 1521, Magellan waded ashore with about 60 armed men. They were met by hundreds of warriors led by Lapu-Lapu. The Europeans' armor meant little in shallow water. Their guns were slow to reload. The islanders swarmed them. Magellan was struck by a poisoned arrow, then a spear, then cut down by blades. He was 41 years old. His body was left behind on the beach. Ironically, the man who initiated the first circumnavigation of Earth did not live to complete it. Only one of his ships, the Victoria, limped back to Spain in 1522. Magellan died not in the vast ocean he had mastered, but in a local skirmish, undone by ambition and underestimation. James Cook. Captain James Cook had charted more of the Pacific than any European before him. He mapped New Zealand, he traced the eastern coast of Australia, he sailed farther south than most thought possible. By the time of his third voyage in 1776, Cook was a legend. But something had changed. Years at sea had hardened him. Some crew members later described him as increasingly irritable and harsh. In 1779, Cook anchored in Kealatekua Bay in Hawaii. At first, relations with the Hawaiians were peaceful, but tensions rose after one of Cook's boats was stolen. Cook made a fatal decision. He attempted to take the Hawaiian chief, Kalaniʻōpuʻu, hostage, a tactic he had used elsewhere to maintain control. It backfired. A crowd gathered, shouting escalated, a stone was thrown, then violence erupted. On February 14, 1579, Cook was struck on the head and stabbed repeatedly. He fell face first into the surf. He was 50 years old. The Hawaiians later treated his body according to their customs reserved for high-ranking individuals, a sign of respect, but to the British it was shocking. The greatest navigator of his era died on a beach thousands of miles from home, killed in a clash sparked by cultural misunderstanding and imperial arrogance. Marco Polo. Not every explorer met a violent end. Marco Polo spent decades traveling through Asia in the 13th century, serving at the court of Kublai Khan and documenting lands Europeans had barely imagined. Unlike the others, Polo returned home. Captured during a war between Venice and Genoa, he dictated his travels to a fellow prisoner. The resulting book, The Travels of Marco Polo, would inspire generations of explorers, including Columbus himself. In his later years, Polo lived as a wealthy merchant in Venice. On January 8, 1324, Marco Polo died peacefully at the age of 69. No ambush, no battlefield, no mutiny, just old age. Legend says that on his bedside, he was urged to recant the more fantastical elements of his stories. He refused. "I have not told half of what I saw," he reportedly said. Unlike many explorers whose lives ended in violence far from home, Polo's journey concluded quietly in the city of his birth. But his words would travel farther than any ship, igniting the very age of exploration that would send others to their deaths on distant shores. The age of exploration created legends. Men who carved their names on coastlines, who planted flags in foreign soil and claimed entire worlds for distant crowns. They chased gold, glory, and immortality. But for many of them, the end was not heroic. It was violent, chaotic, and in some cases, ironic. Hernán Cortés. Hernán Cortés brought down an empire. In 1519, he marched into Mexico with a few hundred men. Within 2 years, the mighty Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. Disease, alliances with rival tribes, and ruthless calculation handed Cortés a victory that reshaped the Americas. For a time, he stood at the peak of power, appointed governor of New Spain, wealthy beyond imagination. But empires are rarely grateful. Political rivals in Spain accused him of corruption and abuse. Royal officials chipped away at his authority. Lawsuits drained his fortune. The conqueror who once commanded armies found himself begging the Spanish crown for recognition and payment. In 1547, Cortés returned to Spain, hoping to restore his standing. He never did. On December 2, 1547, Hernán Cortés died at 62 years old, likely from illness complicated by pleurisy. There was no battlefield, no rebellion, no revenge, just a slow decline. The man who toppled a civilization died far from the lands he conquered, frustrated, politically sidelined, and fighting to reclaim lost prestige. History remembers him as a conqueror. His final years felt more like exile. Francisco Pizarro. Francisco Pizarro watched Cortés's success closely. Inspired by the fall of the Aztecs, Pizarro set his sights on the Inca Empire. In 1532, he captured Emperor Atahualpa in a surprise ambush at Cajamarca. Despite receiving a room filled with gold as ransom, he had him executed. Within years, the Inca Empire collapsed. Pizarro founded Lima, he became governor of Peru, wealth poured in. But conquest breeds resentment and rivals. A power struggle erupted between Pizarro and his former ally, Diego de Almagro. After a civil war between the conquistadors, Almagro was executed on Pizarro's orders. That decision sealed his fate. On June 26, 1541, a group of Almagro's supporters stormed Pizarro's palace in Lima. The 63-year-old conquistador grabbed a sword. He fought, but he was outnumbered. The attackers stabbed him repeatedly. According to accounts, Pizarro drew a cross in his own blood before collapsing to the floor. The conqueror of the Inca Empire died not at the hands of native resistance, but at the blades of fellow Spaniards. He was buried hurriedly in the Cathedral of Lima. In the end, greed and betrayal proved more dangerous than any foreign army. Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson searched for a passage that did not exist. In the early 1600s, European powers desperately wanted a northern route to Asia. Hudson made multiple voyages into the icy Arctic, pushing deeper into frozen waters than most dared. In 1610, sailing aboard the Discovery, Hudson entered what is now known as Hudson Bay. He believed he had found the Northwest Passage. He was wrong. Winter trapped the ship in ice. Supplies ran low. The crew starved. By spring 1611, morale had collapsed. Hudson wanted to continue exploring. His men wanted to go home. They chose mutiny. In June 1611, the crew seized control. Hudson, his teenage son John, and 7 loyal sailors were forced into a small, open boat with minimal supplies. Then they were cast adrift in the freezing waters of Hudson Bay. No one knows exactly what happened next. Starvation, exposure, drowning. Henry Hudson was never seen again. There was no marked grave, no recovered body, just an empty horizon and unanswered questions. The man who mapped vast northern waters vanished into them, claimed by the very passage he sought. Roald Amundsen. Roald Amundsen reached places no human had before. In 1911, he became the first person to reach the South Pole, beating British rival Robert Falcon Scott by weeks. He later pioneered Arctic aviation and navigated the treacherous Northwest Passage. Amundsen thrived where others froze. But in 1928, at 55 years old, he embarked on one final mission, not for conquest, but for rescue. Italian explorer Umberto Nobile had crashed his airship Italia in the Arctic. Amundsen volunteered to help search for survivors. On June 18, 1928, Amundsen boarded a French seaplane, the Latham 47, and took off from Tromsø, Norway. The aircraft disappeared into Arctic fog. Wreckage was later found floating in the Barents Sea, a fuel tank, pieces of debris, but no bodies were ever recovered. Roald Amundsen, the man who conquered the poles, vanished into the same frozen wilderness that made him famous. No execution, no illness, no old age, just sky, ice, and silence.